1,700 lose their jobs at Laker Airways. Sir Freddie's reaction?
I think it's a disaster. Absolute disaster.
The sex scandal at a Belfast home for boys. Most of the inquiry team resign. A Polish pilot flies his airliner and his family to the west. A Grantham school welcomes back its most famous old girl. And the Arabs, who are preparing for the World Cup. Their target, England.
England are not going to get that free kick because the linesman has flagged for backing in by Keegan.
Good evening. It's been another Black Friday for Laker Airways. Last week, Sir Freddie Laker called in the receivers. Today, 1,700 of his staff were made redundant, and the chances of Sir Freddie's getting back in business seem to be receding. The Civil Aviation Authority warned that it could take months for him to get an operator's licence, and Sir Freddie said, if it takes that long, there won't be another airline. So, within 24 hours, the euphoria of Sir Freddie's new partnership with Tiny Rowland of Lonro seems to be evaporating, and the optimism of the Laker staff is being overtaken by the prospect of the dole queues. Michael Burke reporting.
For a rally in London earlier this week, morale was astonishingly high. But today, 2 out of every 3 were told they'd be out of work from midnight. They'll get only the government minimum redundancy payments and even have to hand in their uniforms. Cheerfulness has been replaced by gloom and some resentment.
Well, we've just been told to go home and wait for our redundancy letters. And if anything else comes up, we'll be told.
Do you think anything else will come up?
I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
I don't feel bitter, I feel very sad.
Disappointed that Sir Freddie and the board seem to have ignored us completely. I know that he's trying to start a new airline and there will be new jobs, but there seems to be very, very little spoken about us as a group.
What's happening to the aircrew? Majority are being made redundant. Redundancy notices were handed out today. There have been 52 people kept on amongst the flight deck in case the aircraft need to be ferried around, in case the receiver requires the aircraft in other places.
What's going to happen to them now? Are there alternative jobs?
At this time, there are very few jobs. This might be the best time of the year perhaps to find a job, but the market is very low for pilots' jobs at the moment.
Only this morning, the staff got a thank you letter from Sir Freddie. News of the redundancies was broken to him by reporters.
1,700 of your former employees have been made redundant. I wonder if you get your reaction to that.
Have they? I think it's a disaster. Absolute disaster. It's frightening. And to me, all it means is that we ought to have the licenses immediately so that we can start re-employing some of them.
The Civil Aviation Authority are talking about 3 or 4 months, I believe.
Well, if it's 3 or 4 months, there won't be another airline. I mean, it just has to be done immediately.
Are you now playing a game of brinkmanship with the CAA?
My friend, I do not play cards or Russian roulette or brinkmanship with people's livelihoods. I just don't do that.
Have you set yourself a time
If people
deadline?
are on that particular collision course, someone else is doing it, but it isn't me.
When are you going to the CAA today?
No, I haven't any intention of going.
What about looking for a continuation
of you? I do what I'm usually doing every afternoon, every night, and every morning. I'm working my butt off.
What do you think of British Caledonia's application to take over the Los Angeles route?
Not much.
Are you surprised by it?
I'm not surprised by anything.
Will you fight it yourself?
I was under the impression that everyone had got the message that I've been fighting for the last 34 years.
But you want to hold on to that route, sir?
Well, it's not that route. I want to hold on to as much as I can of Laker Airways. It was my life and the life of my staff, and it would appear that it had a certain amount of sentiment with the rest of the world as well. Money is not the problem. Aeroplanes are not the problem. Staff are not the problem. There's one problem and one only, and that is the licensing problem. Now, someone has to get to grips with that. I want to get to the grips with it. It would appear that a substantial number of people have been put on the dole today. The aeroplanes have been taken out of the air, and I'm trying to get them back. And to be quite honest, while I stand here talking to you, someone else may lose their job.
What about British Airways? Do you expect big trouble for them?
To be quite honest, I don't want to hear about anyone else. I'm interested in Laker Airways. I'm interested in Laker staff. I'm interested in the travelling public. And I don't really want to waste my time talking about anything.
Are you thinking...
Sir Freddie Laker looking and sounding considerably less buoyant today than yesterday. That's partly because so many of his former staff are about to join the dole queues, but also because his People's Airline looks increasingly less likely to get off the ground. He says he needs the licenses for the new airline now. If he has to wait 3 or 4 months, the project will collapse. If that's so, his chances of a comeback are as good as over. The airline licensing system is long and complicated. There'll have to be a series of meetings with the Civil Aviation Authority to work out proposals that seem acceptable. They have to be published, and then 3 weeks must go by to allow for objections that are certain to be put up by rival airlines. Then there'll have to be a public hearing. Even after that, opponents will be able to appeal to the Secretary of State. The whole process is required by law and will take many months. Tonight, the experts are saying that the only way it can be short-circuited is by the new consortium taking over the old Laker Airways. But that would mean shouldering losses that may well turn out to be £100 million. Sir Freddie is clearly hoping the wave of public sympathy will sweep him through these legal obstacles, but many MPs think he's trying to bulldoze through the law.
Well, it looks to me as if they're trying to cut corners. He and Mr. Rowland have formed this new airline, which of course they're quite entitled to do, and they're quite entitled to apply for licenses. But we already know that Mr. Adam Thompson of British Caledonia, and for all I know other air interests in Britain, might wish to apply for these licenses. I think they should be given an opportunity to do so, and I don't think that the public interest is served by rushing around, bending an act of Parliament just to suit Sir Freddie Laker or Mr. Tiny Rowland. I think the public interest here is very important, and I do think that the Civil Aviation Authority ought to inquire very closely into the reasons why Laker Airways collapsed, because quite a lot of people have suffered from it.
According to our political editor, the government is trying to keep at arm's length from the affairs of Laker Airways. Although Mrs. Thatcher admires Sir Freddie personally, the government feels it must tread carefully over the activity of the receivers and the deliberations of the Civil Aviation Authority.
It was Michael Burke. The dispute at Heathrow, which has disrupted British Airways flights, could spread to other European airlines now that it's been made official by the Transport Workers Union. BA ground staff also service the Dutch, Scandinavian, Portuguese and Greek national airlines, and these could all be grounded if tanker drivers and maintenance men refuse to cross the picket lines, which were mounted today. Some catering deliveries have already been stopped, forcing several aircraft, including Concorde, to leave without food. BA says it still hopes to run 80% of flights over the weekend, using volunteers to do the work of the striking baggage handlers. But the union says passengers could find many more flights cancelled or disrupted if delivery drivers agree not to pass the pickets. Mrs. Sally Oppenheim has resigned as Minister for Consumer Affairs in Mrs. Thatcher's government. Her announcement surprised MPs, but it's being stressed that there's no rift between her and the Prime Minister. She's resigning after nearly 3 years in the job, simply to spend more time on family commitments. As a minister, Mrs. Oppenheim was responsible for stopping garages and other retailers from charging more to credit card customers, and her down-to-earth style, especially when electioneering, made her a familiar figure.
This is a Tory shopping basket, what you could buy for £2.16 in 1974, and this is what you can buy for £2.16 after 4 years of Labour government. This is the pound in people's pockets.
Mrs. Oppenheim was widowed 2 years ago, and she's decided to devote more attention to her late husband's business affairs. Mrs. Thatcher accepted her resignation with great regret, describing her as a very successful minister. And inflation stayed at 12% in January for the third month in a row, and it seems that, but for the effect of bad weather on food prices, the inflation rate would have gone down. The building societies took in £356 million in January, giving them their best month since last summer. It's expected this will strengthen the case for a cut in the mortgage rate. The official inquiry into a major sex scandal at a boys' home in Belfast has run into serious trouble on the first day of hearings. 3 of the inquiry team of 5 have resigned, saying there are growing suggestions that major criminal aspects of the case still haven't been dealt with. 3 staff members at the Kincora boys' home have already been sent to jail. From Belfast, Chris Moore.
Since 3 Kincora staff members were jailed last December for homosexual abuses against boys during the past 20 years, there's been growing criticism of the government's decision to hold an inquiry behind closed doors. The reason for public disquiet has been the mounting allegations concerning the home that there's been a cover-up, and it's become known that a homosexual vice ring involving boys in care operated in Belfast in the mid-70s. William McGrath, one of the men convicted, had loyalist political connections and was a well-known figure in the Orange Order, and there have been allegations that some loyalist politicians had suspicions about Kincora. Last night, the government inquiry team's legal advisor revealed that he'd resigned, and today his resignation was followed by that of 3 other members of the committee who have declined to elaborate.
We put the reason in the statement, and I really have nothing to add to that.
But obviously the 3 of you were very concerned about the present situation.
We were very concerned indeed, and we felt that this was the only way in which progress could be made.
And that effectively leaves inquiry chairman Stephen McGonigal in the dark.
If Mr. Pryor wants consultation with me, he'll get it. And I will have something to say about the whole area of investigation, with emphasis on the care of the children. As far as I'm concerned, that must take first priority, rather than an investigation into escapades and incidents.
How quickly do you think the committee can actually get down to working again?
That I can't tell you. There may not be a committee, so I couldn't answer that question. I couldn't answer that question tonight. I don't know whether there will be a committee or not.
A pilot of the Polish airline LOT has flown his aircraft with 6 members of his family on board to West Berlin and asked for asylum. The plane was on a scheduled internal flight from Warsaw to Wrocław with 19 passengers and 4 crew when the pilot changed course for West Berlin and the American military base at Tempelhof Airport. The aircraft landed safely at Tempelhof, and apparently no one in the passenger cabin, including 2 security guards, had noticed the change of direction. American military authorities and West Berlin police questioned all the crew and passengers, including the 2 uniformed security men. The pilot and 6 of his family said they were seeking asylum. The co-pilot and another passenger also said they wanted to stay in West Berlin. In Warsaw, the Polish authorities staged a big show of strength last night. A column of more than 100 military and police vehicles drove through the centre of the capital, halting rush hour traffic. It's 2 months tomorrow since martial law was imposed, and it's thought the display was to discourage any weekend demonstrations by opponents.
And at today's European Security Conference session in Madrid, Poland was again top of the agenda. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, said the imposition of martial law wasn't necessarily to be condemned, but it...
Oh, I'm sorry, something seems to have gone wrong with our pictures there. A former Navy minister publicly attacked the government's defence policy tonight, saying it was in a big muddle and getting worse. Mr. Keith Speed, who was sacked by Mrs. Thatcher for criticising cuts in defence spending, warned that it would be disastrous to spend large sums on the advanced Trident missile system and had to cut back on conventional forces to pay for it. A ferocious Atlantic gale has been hampering efforts throughout the day to rescue 30 people on board the Greek tanker Victory, which broke in 2 after being smashed by heavy seas in mid-Atlantic. The ship was 500 miles north of the Azores when she sent out a mayday call this morning. 20 people are said to be clinging to the floating stern section, but a life raft with 13 on board has broken up without trace. The insurers of the oil cargo on the supertanker Salem, scuttled 2 years ago in a massive maritime fraud, are not liable for the cargo's £24 million value. The appeal court decided today that the underwriters are only liable for the small amount of oil still on board when she went down. The Salem left Kuwait in December 1979. It's now known that 2 weeks later in Durban she discharged most of the oil. But at the time nothing was heard until mid-January when the Salem went down off Senegal. Lord Denning and 2 other judges ruled that the bulk of the cargo was not strictly taken at sea and not therefore covered by the marine policy under which Shell International were claiming. Both sides were given leave to appeal to the Lords. Planes have been flying again at Shoreham Airport in West Sussex after being grounded by a bomb emergency. The discovery of a 1,000-pound German wartime bomb at the airport had also meant that 700 people were evacuated from the area. But the emergency ended when the bomb was successfully defused. Bruce Parker reports.
The airport was closed to all air traffic for 15 hours after the bomb was discovered, just 8 feet below grass over which thousands of light aircraft have taxied during the past 40 years. A team of Royal Engineers had been searching for old wartime explosives as a security measure before work starts on extensions to the airport. Although the airfield was mined by the British during the war years as a precaution against invasion, the discovery of a German bomb came as a complete surprise. Using special steam treatment developed in the Second World War, an army bomb disposal squad took 3 hours to make safe the bomb. The explosive was delicately extracted and later burned off harmlessly.
President Reagan will be paying a visit to Britain from the 7th to the 9th of June as part of his first European tour since taking office. He'll have talks with Mrs. Thatcher while he's here, though he'll be the guest of the Queen. Could be a busy time at Buckingham Palace then. The Princess of Wales is expecting her baby sometime in June, though it's not yet known precisely when. As for President Reagan, his next appointment after leaving London will be to attend the conference of NATO heads of government in Bonn. The Prime Minister went back to school today and was met by more than 100 young people protesting about unemployment. It was the first time Mrs. Thatcher had visited her old school in Grantham since becoming Prime Minister. Mike Smart went along too.
Demonstrators, some of them also past pupils, gave the most famous old girl of the Kesteven and Grantham Girls' School a hostile reception. But the warmth of the welcome from the present girls, most of whom still take the 11 plus to gain entry, more than made up for that. Mrs. Thatcher, or Margaret Roberts as she was then, was a star pupil in the 40s, eventually going on to gain degrees in chemistry and law. The laboratory where she first learned her theories, of the chemical variety, is still there, and Mrs. Thatcher demonstrated a remarkable memory for detail. Mrs. Thatcher, has it changed much since the days you...
Oh, well, yeah, no, the hall hasn't. This lab actually is the same. It has changed remarkably little. Even the same taps, even the same... Yes. No, that's a new one. They were like that. They were all...
And then the 670 pupils listened spellbound as the Prime Minister recalled her childhood and with tears welling in her eyes awarded her old school the supreme accolade.
And so I am so very, very grateful to have been a pupil here. And if I were to choose from the whole of our country to which school I would go, once again, I would choose Kesteven and Grantham Girls' School, for there is none better.
Pope John Paul has arrived in Lagos, the capital of Nigeria, at the start of his four-nation West African tour. He was met by President Shagari, a 21-gun salute, and a huge crowd. As usual, on arriving, the Pope knelt for a moment to kiss the ground. It's his first trip abroad since he was shot last May. Later, at the National Stadium, the Pope celebrated Mass before a congregation of some 60,000. He said the visit was for him a moment of great joy. After 5 days in Nigeria, Pope John Paul will go on to Benin, Equatorial Guinea and Gabon. The Football Association has lifted the ban preventing Chelsea fans from attending away matches. They were barred from away games until the end of the season after serious disturbances at Derby County's ground. But the ban proved impossible to enforce, and now the FA has reversed its earlier decision, although it'll still keep a close watch on all Chelsea's matches. One of the less fancied teams to qualify for the World Cup finals has already begun its pre-tournament training 4 months before the competition starts. The players from the Gulf state of Kuwait know their chances of winning the Cup are pretty slim, so they're concentrating on something perhaps a little easier, beating England. Keith Graves has been to Kuwait to size up the opposition.
The only people, it appears, who were not surprised by Kuwait's achievement in reaching the World Cup finals were the Kuwaitis themselves. 4 years ago, Sheikh Fahid Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah, a sports fanatic and youngest brother of the ruler of the unbelievably oil-rich state, decided it would be so. Spurred on, no doubt, by the derisive chants of camel drivers from a crowd at one overseas match. And you can't help but admire Kuwait's achievement. There was, after all, very little to work on. There are only 400 senior players, absolutely no footballing or sporting tradition as we know it, and a climate that would put the steam room of those English clubs lucky enough to have one to shame. Dave Mackay, ex-Scotland and Spurs, is one of the men responsible for turning Sheikh Fahid's dream into reality. He's also a realist himself.
Obviously, I don't think they could win the World Cup, but I'm quite certain Kuwait will go there and put on a very, very good show for Kuwait itself. And to me, I think that any club or any country that comes along and thinks they're going to beat Kuwait very easily, they'll find they'll be wrong in the finish.
The Kuwaitis are somewhat reticent about their wealth, but the car park of the Kuwait FA is a bit of a giveaway. And the facilities available inside would turn any English team with their £1 million stars green with envy. Part of their intensive training programme involves careful study of their opponents.
But in fact, England are not going to get that free kick because the linesman has flagged for backing in by Keegan.
Mahbub will have the job of neutralising Keegan. It will, he says, with a gleam in his eye, be an honour. Yaqub will lead the attack. An attacking game is what Kuwait fancies. And Sheikh Fahid, who admits that while stories of his players being millionaires is nonsense, there will be something in it for them if they do well, is full of confidence.
Well, if they carry on the same way they prepare themselves for the last 4 or 5 years, it's very easy to beat them. I mean, with my respect to everybody in England, the preparation is not good.
Mr. Greenwood, when he was asked about your team, said he didn't know anything about the Kuwait team.
Well, we are sending an invitation for him to come here, so will he have no excuse after.
No excuse when you beat England?
No excuse when we beat England.
Now the main points of the news again. And we've just heard that there have been 3 explosions in Northern Ireland near the main Belfast to Dublin railway line on the border in South Armagh. The police had prior warning and no one was injured. 1,700 Laker Airways staff have lost their jobs. Sir Freddie calls it an absolute disaster. And we've just received these pictures of what's left of the Greek tanker Victory, which broke in half in the Atlantic. Efforts to rescue about 20 of the crew on the stern section are being hampered by ferocious gales. BBC Television News has won a major international award for its reporting. It was a report last May on one aspect of the IRA hunger strike, which took the first prize in the news section at the International Television Festival in Monte Carlo. The film was made in Belfast during the violence which followed the death of the hunger striker Francis Hughes.
Elsewhere, the police and army were shot at and in the markets area spent several hours trying to contain groups of youths hurling missiles from behind creeping bits of barricade.
Wait for it now, boy. Wait for it, don't worry about that. Wait for it. Wait. Ready,
Plastic bullets are the standard reply. The rioters are wary of them, but not unduly discouraged.
The winning reporter was Kate Adie, the film cameraman Peter Beggin and Bernard Hesketh, the sound recordists Roy Benford and John Jockle. That's all from me, apart from congratulations. Good night.
Good evening to you. A very angry look to the weather once again with this very deep area of low pressure close by the British Isles, tightly packed isobars, so the main theme of tonight's weather most certainly is the strong winds, or are the gales as well, as come to that. We've also got frontal systems pushing in from the west, and they're going to bring cloud and rain to much of the country. In fact, they've done just that already. Now, earlier on this morning, that area of low pressure was in a very different position. If we look at the satellite picture from that time, it was way to the south of Iceland. The frontal systems, too, were hanging back west of the country. But by an hour ago, things had changed. The area of low pressure had moved much closer to Iceland. The frontal system itself had begun to come in over the country, and it was in turn being followed by clearer, showery weather. So as far as tonight's